Like most people, I was first exposed to the on-screen magic of fantasy films during my childhood. And because that childhood occurred during the 1980s, I may be a little biased in believing that the 1980s were the golden age of fantasy films. As a kid, I simply thought these movies were really cool and fun to watch. But as a grown-ass man, I can appreciate that they go deeper than simply telling fantastical and visually stunning stories. Much deeper. Some of the movies I watched as a kid address themes and ideas that most adults would miss, let alone kids. I may be reading into some of these films a bit too much, but regardless, in this video I will go over my personal interpretations of the deeper themes and meanings in 4 classic fantasy films from the best fantasy decade, the 1980s. Let's start with one of my all-time favorites, the 1986 film Labyrinth.
You remind me of the babe.
Labyrinth is a musical coming-of-age fantasy story directed by the master puppeteer Jim Henson, starring David Bowie and a young Jennifer Connelly. The story follows a young girl, Sarah, who is reluctant to let go of the dreams and frivolity of her childhood, and accept the oncoming responsibility of her adulthood. When Sarah half-heartedly wishes for it, her baby brother, Toby, is kidnapped by Jareth, the Goblin King. So Sarah must go on a journey to the center of a magical labyrinth to confront the Goblin King and rescue Toby.
You have 13 hours in which to solve the labyrinth before your baby brother becomes one of us forever.
Labyrinth takes story elements from Lewis Carroll's Alice novels and The Wizard of Oz, but reimagines them in an unmistakably 80s way, with synth-heavy musical numbers and elaborately constructed puppetry. The story purposefully adapts ideas from Joseph Campbell's theories on the hero's journey, or monomyth. Joseph Campbell's work hugely influenced George Lucas when he wrote the original Star Wars trilogy, and not surprisingly, George was an executive producer on Labyrinth. The monomyth is a theoretical template that most ancient myths and folktales follow, but in this video I will focus more on the way Labyrinth symbolically depicts Sarah's journey from childhood into adulthood. Many of the film's characters and settings represent different aspects of this journey, and the potential pitfalls it presents. In the beginning of the story, Sarah still acts like a child, despite being in her early teens. Her motives are completely selfish and inconsiderate of others. When she is given the responsibility of babysitting her younger brother Toby, she acts indignant and annoyed at being inconvenienced. However, after she wishes for Toby to be taken, and he is, she quickly realizes the seriousness of her mistake.
But I didn't mean it.
Oh, you didn't?
The labyrinth itself represents Sarah's inner journey. Unicursal labyrinths have long been a tool for meditation and self-reflection, and the enormous maze in the film serves the same purpose. The first ally Sarah meets in the labyrinth is Hogwart, or whatever his name is.
Oh, it's Hoggle!
Hoggle is a character who seems indifferent to her at first, and in fact betrays her at one point, but ultimately proves to be a true and loyal friend. Hoggle represents a person who is flawed as the result of some trauma they have suffered, but has potential to rise above it and become a meaningful friend and ally. It takes a mature, wise soul to see this potential in them, and because Sarah becomes an adult through her journey, she does. Ludo and Sir Didymus also represent friends who have flaws and are perhaps not the sharpest tools in the shed, but whom are truly loyal and committed in their support.
Hello.
The worm reminds us that sometimes the wisdom we seek can come from the smallest and most unlikely of places. The Fiery Gang represent the temptation to become involved with people whose only focus is to have fun, even at the price of their own self-destruction, i.e., they're partiers.
Of course it doesn't.
The Junk Lady represents the temptation to become caught up in materialism, seeking fulfillment in possessions rather than what truly matters.
Well, what about this? This is not junk, eh?
Yes, it is.
So, what about the villain, Jareth the Goblin King? Well, first of all, how many times have you heard girls, or guys, remark how hot David Bowie is in this role? His casting and character were not an accident. Jareth represents one of the biggest potential pitfalls when entering adulthood: sexual desire and attraction. Of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with sexual desire, but if it is toward the wrong person, a manipulative person, it can lead you to forget your principles and yourself.
Just let me rule you, and you can have everything that you want.
This is the threat that Jareth represents. There are times that Sarah does want to forget herself and just go with him. but ultimately she stays true to her principles, her friends, and her family, thus transforming fully into an adult.
Well, why didn't you say so?
Another classic 80s fantasy flick and favorite of mine since childhood is the 1984 adaptation of Michael Ende's novel, The NeverEnding Story. The film follows a young boy, Bastian, who after the death of his mother begins to use fantasy novels as a means of escape. When he comes across a magical book and begins to read it, he is unwittingly drawn into the role of savior for a dying fantasy realm, Fantasia.
But that's impossible!
The story of The NeverEnding Story illustrates the power of imagination and creativity. Once Bastian is drawn into the narrative of Atreyu's quest, he realizes he has the power to recreate the world of Fantasia as he wishes. This is a not-so-subtle metaphor for self-actualization, through creativity and ambition, but there is also a darker side to Fantasia. Well, technically it's not dark or light, it's simply nothing.
A hole?
A hole would be something. No, it was nothing.
The nothing represents the complete opposite of creativity. It is a lack of imagination, lack of ideas, lack of hope, and essentially the death of one's inner self. The true meaning of the nothing is revealed in the speech Gmork gives to Atreyu when they finally meet. But Gmork makes reference to an even more heinous purpose behind the nothing.
People who have no hopes are easy to control, and whoever has the control has the power.
The author of the novel, Michael Ende, lived through Nazi Germany and witnessed their suppression of creativity and free thinking firsthand. The son of a surrealist painter, Michael's father was banned by the Nazis from making work, so Ende became all too familiar with the Nazi agenda of eliminating creativity and ultimately hope, dehumanizing their subjects to the point that they could easily be controlled and manipulated. This is the true meaning of the nothing. It represents the death of the human spirit by those who would seek to control us. But if you keep dreaming, imagining, and creating, you will always be free, like Bastian. Next up, we have a sword and sorcery epic that launched Arnold Schwarzenegger's career, the 1982 film Conan the Barbarian. Based on the novels by Robert E. Howard, Conan the Barbarian is a fantastical reimagining of ancient history, myths, and legends. As a young boy, Conan's parents are murdered by Thulsa Doom, shortly before he is sold into slavery. However, years of the world's greatest fitness regimen pushing the wheel of pain transforms Conan into a bemuscled badass, who quickly fights his way to the top of the pit fighting circuit. After being freed, Conan first seeks his fortune as a thief with his trusty sidekick Subadai and love interest Valeria, and later sets out to avenge his parents' death and rescue a princess while he's at it. Conan the Barbarian seems to be a pretty standard fantasy tale. It utilizes very common themes for the genre, like bravery, strength, vengeance, etc. So what lies beneath the surface of this story? The answer lies with the most complex character, the evil sorcerer Thulsa Doom, played by James Earl Jones. The character of Thulsa was intended to depict the last of a dying race, a once mighty and advanced civilization that has since fallen. What Thulsa truly represents is hinted at in this scene.
Steel isn't strong, boy. Flesh is stronger.
Thulsa once searched for steel, and because Conan's people were known for their weapons, he took their steel and slaughtered them. Years later, when Conan seeks revenge, Thulsa has moved on to a different kind of power. Not power through physical might, but power through manipulation.
That is strength, boy. That is power. The strength and power of flesh.
Thulsa is at this point the leader of a religious cult, and has complete power over his subjects by appealing to their need for spiritual fulfillment. This is a far more complete power than weapons can provide. Conan worships the barbarian god Crom, but in fact he does not rely on him at all.
Grant me revenge.
And if you do not listen,
Then to hell with you.
This makes Conan completely self-reliant in life as well as spiritual matters. He represents strength from within the individual. Thulsa, on the other hand, represents the danger of those who would attempt to control others by appealing to their inner self-doubt and emptiness. In the end, Thulsa attempts to appeal to this side of Conan, but of course, in the spirit of self-reliance, Conan ignores this and executes his vengeance.
Crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of their women.
Finally, we have one of the most beloved and quoted classics of the fantasy genre, the 1987 film The Princess Bride. The Princess Bride is about two young lovers, Wesley and Buttercup, who are separated for 5 years only to be reunited when Wesley returns to rescue Buttercup from her marriage to and following murder by Prince Humperdinck. However, that's not really what the film is about. It's about a grandfather who reads a novel to his grandson while he's sick and staying home from school. The Princess Bride is based on the novel of the same name by William Goldman, who also wrote the screenplay for this film. While it is today one of the most popular fantasy films of all time, at the time of its release it did very poorly in cinemas.
Inconceivable!
This is most likely due to the fact that it's a hard film to categorize. It is simultaneously a satire of fairy tales and fables and a celebration of them. At its core, however, it's a story about storytelling and the loss of it from modern culture. Even in the 1980s, culture was becoming more instantaneous, less patient, and more forgetful of the wisdom and values that were previously instilled by storytelling. Of course, in 2017, we've gone a lot further down that road. The film appropriately opens on a video game, played by Fred Savage, the grandson, illustrating what the younger generation now considers worthwhile entertainment. The grandfather, played by Peter Falk, coerces the boy into listening while he reads a book, a story that has been told through the generations in their family. As the grandfather begins to read the story, the boy begrudgingly gives him his attention, and we are immersed into the fantasy world of Wesley and Buttercup. But the boy repeatedly interrupts and asks the grandfather to skip by certain parts.
Skip onto the fire swamp, that sounded good.
This represents the short attention span of the new generation, and its need for specialization. Only what interests the boy immediately is considered valuable, and any potential development of interest from other areas is immediately halted and discarded.
Where's the sports? Is this a kissing book?
However, as the grandfather continues to read, the boy finds himself absorbed in the narrative, in spite of himself. At one point in the story, Buttercup seemingly marries the villain, Prince Humperdinck, and the boy states,
"It wouldn't be fair."
This illustrates the new generation's accustomedness to narratives that omit all dark and challenging elements. In the new culture, any aspects that might hurt popularity or trigger controversy are edited out, despite their potential value in the long term. But the boy quickly overcomes his dismay, and the grandfather continues the story. In the end, the boy is transformed by the narrative, including the troublesome aspects, and even the kissy parts.
I don't mind so much.
Okay.
The gift of storytelling has been passed down once again from the old generation to the new. So, do you agree with my points on these films? Was I reading into them too much, or perhaps too little? What are your interpretations of the deeper themes and meanings in these and other fantasy films? Please let me know in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe for more videos, including more interpretations of themes, meanings, and symbolism in classic movies. Or support the channel by donating to the Story Dive Patreon. I'll see you next time. That is, if it's...